Hi, and welcome back. This is the second in the series of short lectures that I've compiled to support my seminar in social stratification at the University of Oxford. This week's seminar is a little longer than usual. I'm afraid, as the hoary old line goes, I didn't have time to make it any shorter. Well, let's get on with it then. Before we go any further, I want to dispel a source of potential confusion that will get in the way unless I knock it on the head right from the start. The readings for this week are, inter alia, about social status, its sources and corollaries. However, when I use the words social status, I'm not talking about the scales of socioeconomic status or occupational prestige routinely adopted in a lot of North American sociology. That kind of thing is interesting in its own right, but its connection to the concept of social status that I want to discuss here is, at best, tangential. Moreover, the way of understanding social stratification that it represents has actually never been very popular in Europe. If I were talking to you from Madison, Chicago, or Ann Arbor, the emphasis of this lecture would no doubt be quite different. But I'm not, and therefore what you will get is a view that is rooted in a very European usage and sensibility. Max Weber wrote about social status in two different parts of what has come to be known in English as economy and society. Firstly, a short conceptual sketch in Volume 1, and then, in the posthumously compiled Volume 2, a much fuller treatment. What is usually rendered into English as status position is what Weber calls in German ständische Lage. Stand could reasonably be translated as estate, but in English the connotations are somewhat archaic, mannered, and actually unduly narrow. Status seems to have the right degree of generality. Lage is straightforwardly translatable as position, location, or situation, but it also has connotations of layer or level, implying some sort of hierarchical or rank ordering. Different translators have opted for different solutions to the translation problem, but it seems clear enough that status position is not seriously misleading. And in any case, whatever words we use, there can be little doubt as to what Weber means, because he defines it very explicitly. I've heard it argued that in defining what he meant by social status, and in his subsequent discussion of the idea, Weber had in mind a concept that was intended primarily to be applicable to pre-modern or pre-industrial societies. This is a claim that can't withstand even a cursory reading of his text. It's clear from the examples he gives that he's concerned with both contemporary and historical societies. Status is contrasted with class as an ideal typical principle of social differentiation. Both principles are of relevance to a description of the functioning of any actual society, though their degree of relevance may vary. Weber is also clear that the balance may vary over time, waxing and waning, and has some interesting conjectures as to how and when this might occur. Weber tells us that occupying a status position means that you can exercise a socially recognized claim to esteem, or be subject to socially recognized disparagement. In contradistinction to social class, then, status is about a form of differentiation that is explicitly evaluative rather than just functional. Status is tied up with judgments about higher and lower, better and worse, acceptable and unacceptable. He goes on to tell us that this form of evaluative judgment can be rooted in different social institutions, distinct styles of life, formal education, and hereditary or occupational prestige. Think of the Bloomsbury set's manner or style of living and their utter disdain for a popular novelist like Arnold Bennett, but, rather paradoxically, acceptance of the socially humble but avant-garde artistically D.H. Lawrence. Or what about George Orwell's observation in his essay on boys' weeklies? So far as I know, there are extremely few school stories in foreign languages. The reason, obviously, is that in England, education is mainly a matter of status. The most definite dividing line between the petty bourgeoisie and the working class is that the former pay for their education, and within the bourgeoisie there is another unbridgeable gap between the public school and the private school. Or how about this from the Yorkshire agricultural labourer Fred Kitchen, writing in his autobiography Brother to the Ox about meeting, just a few years before the First World War, his girl's parents. I shall spare you an attempt at a Yorkshire accent. I suppose it's a trying time for every man, being introduced for the first time into her family, but to me it was very much so, for the distance between a coachman and a farm lad was, in those days, terrific. Having told us what status is and what its social bases are, Weber then tells us how it is expressed, by which he means where to look if we are to observe the operation of social status in the wild. He directs our gaze by pointing his finger at marriage, who marries whom, at eating, whom do we invite to our dinner table, at claims to exclusive rights to exercise privileges and exclude others from them, and to norms that prohibit holders of some positions of high status from entering some lines of employment upon pain of becoming déclassés, and subsequently, therefore, estranged from former associates. Finally, he mentions status conventions, so-called traditions of other kinds, as he puts it. It seems reasonable to suppose that Weber points at marriage and eating as examples of a wider marker of status group membership, what we might call free association, which also encompasses friendship, for example, as well as marriage. Social equals may marry without incurring opprobrium, just as social equals may dine without feeling socially awkward or inhibited, or choose each other as friends. In societies where social status is the primary axis of differentiation, the rules that govern association tend to be hardwired into the institutional structure. The most obvious example is the ideal-type Indian caste system, in which feelings of distaste, and actually inconvenience, occasioned by the wrong sort of contact with inferior castes, is underpinned by religiously based notions of ritual pollution. But it's not difficult to find historical examples much closer to home. In the early 1880s, the novelist Anthony Trollope reflected in his autobiography, "It seems that intimate friendship admits of no standing but that of equality. I cannot be the sovereign's friend, nor probably the friend of many much beneath the sovereign, because such equality is impossible." George Eliot, writing in the 1870s but recalling the small-town provincial life she experienced 40 years earlier, writes, "There were nice distinctions of rank in Middlemarch. Though old manufacturers could not any more than dukes be connected with none but equals, they were conscious of an inherent social superiority which was defined with great nicety in practice, though hardly expressible theoretically." The historian Harold Perkin takes up this theme in his account of the rise of the suburbs during the 19th century. Suburban ladies and their daughters, with nothing to do in their large, many-servanted villas after the head of the household had left by the morning train, went through elaborate rituals of calling on each other and leaving their visiting cards. Only families of the same social standing were visited. For a newcomer to leave her cards without first being visited and accepted was to invite a polite but firm rebuff, and every new family was scrutinised and its antecedents checked before the ladies of the suburb pronounced it respectable. On the other hand, the suburban ladies avoided like the plague calling on the ladies of county society, out of fear of the same rebuff and of being accused of social climbing by their peers. A staple of the plots of Victorian novels is the need to find suitable positions for the younger sons of southern provincial gentlefolk of the middling sort. The military, at least the less fashionable regiments, might just be possible. A curacy in a parish with a small living would be acceptable. Perhaps a clerkship to an attorney might be contemplated. But entrance into trade would, without doubt, bring shame upon the family and sever their connection with respectable local society. Better, too, that the daughter live a life of respectable spinsterhood than make a socially unsuitable alliance. And all the while, there is the elephant in the room, an example of Weber's status conventions of other kinds. This is the question of who is and who is not a gentleman, a question that haunted the English middle-class psyche right until the end of the first half of the 20th century. It was a question that was far from easy to answer. Like pornography, it was difficult to define, but you knew it when you saw it, as you did the difference between living like a gentleman and actually being a gentleman. Who qualified was partly a matter of family ancestry, but ancestry was definitely not essential. Acting in the right way was more important. Looking the part, having the right manners, excuse me, an easy confidence, and the ability to act correctly towards inferiors and superiors would all count in your favour. But there is also a somewhat ineffable moral quality expressed by the idea of being a true gentleman at heart. Richard Faber, in his Proper Stations Class in Victorian Fiction, expresses it as having the right feelings, or even the right soul. At the end of the day, a gentleman was whoever was accepted as a gentleman by the self-selecting group that got to do the choosing. But of course status differentiation is as rife at the bottom of the social pile as it is at the top. I was brought up in the Midlands in the 1960s and 70s. The distinction between the rough end of our street, where the front doors opened directly onto the pavement, and the respectable end, where houses had a postage stamp sized front garden, was an obvious part of the local scene, and obviously part of taking for granted knowledge. Richard Hogarth, in his autobiography, recalls a similar classificatory reflex from his boyhood in 1930s Leeds. The life of the street was, then, a matter of multiple fine gradings, Any child above the age of 4 or 5 knew its own area, and that area was usually no more than 5 or 6 streets. How were the boundaries decided? By types of people and by street furniture. This cluster of streets belonged to the Irish. This thought itself slightly better than the others around it, and this was thought to be slightly less respectable. That fine shading by possessive identification extended to all the local shops. He was our butcher, grocer, confectioner, and we were quite sure our shops were better than theirs. One key distinction that Weber draws between social class and social status as principles of social stratification is that social status requires a measure of self-recognition and awareness, an understanding of who is in and who is out. Without this boundary policing, social closure is impossible. Thus, status groups are inherently social groups in a way that social classes, though they may become so, are not necessarily so. Status defines a social relationship of acceptance and derogation. The superior cannot have a sense of group identity without the existence of the inferiors, who are held at arm's length. This, of course, raises the question of the extent to which groups, held as in some way inferior, are prepared to accept their lot. It may be that all that is actually required are the external signs and signals of deference. The squire or the vicar may rest easily in their beds as long as the farm labourers remove their caps in his presence and don't get above themselves by acting saucily towards his womenfolk. What they think and say about him in the privacy of the tap room is possibly beneath his consideration. Weber pays some attention to the nature of deference in his discussion of societies where the status relationship pertains to ethnic groups. Jews in the Holy Roman Empire lived under civil disabilities and had little choice, even when wealthy, but to acknowledge their position of social inferiority in a Christian society. At the same time, they sustained their self-esteem in the way that most downtrodden people do by telling themselves that, despite all appearances, in all the ways that really mattered, their group possessed special qualities and virtues that distinguished them in a good way from those that despised and mistreated them. It is, of course, important to ask whether and how a status order can survive a generalised decline in deferential behaviour. That deference to social superiors has all but vanished from everyday life in Britain, except in some highly choreographed situations, is now more or less taken for granted. When the decline of deference started is difficult to tell. Some date it to the aftermath of the First World War and the decline of the servant-keeping classes. Others to the bitterness engendered by the Hungry Thirties, consolidated by the democratising experience of total war between 1939 and 1945. Another candidate is the rise of working-class affluence in the late 1950s, coinciding with the emergence of commercial youth culture and followed by the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. Clearly, a world of mass consumption, in which gross differences in physical appearance, as well as some of the other outward trappings of rank, are muted, is a less friendly habitat for the preservation of the older modes of status distinction. But are there new ways? Is status now expressed in the consumption choices we make and the tastes we express in our purchases and cultural pursuits? There is certainly a rather long tradition of thinking this is so. Daniel Bell, in The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, puts it like this. For Thorstein Veblen, the impulse towards conspicuous consumption, which he describes in the theory of the leisure class, is the expression of the desire for status differentiation, which motivates all social behaviour. In this quest, individuals seek status-conferring goods, and those who seek to share the status emulate their styles. Consumption may not, of course, be just aspirational. It may also be defensive, a way of telling yourself and anyone you care to let know that you are not like the other people. The playwright Alan Bennett, whose father was a co-op butcher, says of his mother's love of collecting bric-a-brac, "Still, her antiques, touching though they were in their inadequacy, were not an attempt to improve our social status. Though she herself would have said she liked old stuff because it was classy, this definition had nothing to do with class. Classy in her vocabulary, simply the opposite of common." That was the real nub of it, because if there was one consideration that determined my parents' conduct and defined their position in the world, it was not to be, or to be thought, common. There is an important sense in which a lot of status differentiation works at a local level. The distinctions I might have made in my youth between the inhabitants of different parts of my street are particular to me and my local milieu. Though it might have been the case that in the Victorian times the right sort of person could sniff out a gentleman or an impostor according to some ineffable criteria that was somehow shared by all genuine gentlemen, even those whose acquaintance one had never made, it's reasonable to ask whether such criteria still exist. It's perfectly possible to acknowledge that status groups still exist at the micro level, yet deny that there is anything like a general status order at the macro level. This is the motivation for Chan and Goldthorpe's empirical investigation. In reading it, it is important to bear in mind that they are investigating a highly specific question. Not social status in all the manifestations I've discussed, but whether one can identify a general status ordering in the population that can plausibly be discriminated from other sources of social stratification, such as social class. Cultural consumption is widely held to be a marker of social distinction in contemporary societies, not least by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu and his followers. But what is the relationship between cultural tastes, social status, and social class? Do coherent syndromes of taste actually exist? Are these things ultimately separable? Is it useful to think of some as explanatory variables and others as dependent variables? These are some of the questions raised by the second pair of readings. Some people seem to have a rather restricted cultural repertoire. Others have rather Catholic tastes that encompass both the highbrow and some aspects of mass culture. Cultural omnivores appear to pose a problem for a theory of cultural distinction. Bourdieu says rather clearly that all cultural choices, by definition, amount to acts of discrimination. The choice of one type of thing implies the refusal of others, and that refusal amounts to a judgment about other people. But if this is so, what should we think about those who refuse nothing, or very little? What kind of people are these? Are they just people who by personality or psychology are predisposed to be more open to a variety of experiences? These and other questions are the core of the conversation that takes place in the third pair of articles.